Hey guys, welcome back, it's Meg. Today we are doing the part 2 to the hardest encounters of Season 3 of Dragonflight. Starting out, we are in Galakrond's Fall, and this is the entire sand room. This room is notorious for its difficulty handling multiple debuffs at one time, as well as having some pretty hefty tank busters and dispel issues. The mobs that you're mostly going to be concerned with are the moments as well as the coalesce time. The moments are the smaller sand elemental looking things, and they are going to be throwing out what I call pocket sand. I don't actually know the real name of the ability, but that is the non-dispellable dot. And then you have the chrono burst coming out from the coalesce time, and that is the magic debuff that you're seeing on the frames. That one is dispellable. This is just a clip of the chrono burst technology. If you are off of the platform when the debuff expires, it is not going to deal damage. You just have to deal with the initial dot ticking down. But this way you can save your debuffs for the blooms if that is something that you are pulling with those packs, but it is mostly just to save on defensives for the non-dispellable sand, if that is present in the pack as well. If you do not have a defensive on a certain level, I believe it's around 27 on Fortified, the Chrono Burst going off will just straight up kill you if you're not using a defensive, so this is really nice for classes that don't have a whole lot of defensives. But it is not something that I would necessarily expect pugs to do unless you are at the level at which it is starting to become common knowledge, that strategy. If you're not doing the jump off of the ledge strategy, then I actually usually will just not dispel the chrono burst at all. I will let them expire naturally. This gives people more chance to get away from the intervals, which are the small things that spawn if they're hit with the debuff circle as it goes off. If people are full health, I will occasionally use Revival like I did earlier in this pack, but generally it's something that I kind of just let fall off, and then if my target does not have a defensive, I will use either my Leaf of Ancient Protectors on them, or Chi Cocoons, or Life Cocoon. When it comes to the non-dispellable sand, the pocket sand as I like to call it, it's normally just a spot healing situation. You can send Shaylin's Gift on it, you can use Chi-Ji to spot heal, you can use Cocoon and Leaf if you have them up and available, but sometimes it just does end up being the single target Soothing Mist rotation just to keep them alive. And that's fine, because this is some of the most hard-hitting trash, and most people expect to have deaths in this room. It's pretty common to have like 3 or 4, I think, is usually how many times people are dying. It also depends on the affixes. Obviously, Fortify is going to hurt a lot more, and then you have situations like this week where it is bolstering, and you're going to have potentially a heavier hitting dot. When it comes to the blooms from the dogs, that is a 2-person debuff as well. One will always go on the tank, and one will always go on someone else. You are always going to want to be dispelling the other person, because the tank is going to be amplifying that damage, and the tank can take it, however our DPS players cannot. If it doesn't apply to the tank, it will not apply to the second person, so you can use Bubble preemptively to avoid a set. You can also use things like AMS to eat a set. It's very easy to kind of utilize those things, but it's not an expectation that I regularly have, so make sure that you are dispelling the non-tank target. You can see there I used Dampen Harm on myself and I used Cocoon on my mage as we were the 2 Chrono Burst targets. Coming up for this next set, really all you want to focus on for these debuffs, if you're letting them fall naturally and not jumping off the ledge, is just making sure that people are full health before the debuff expires. Usually I will do that by sending Shaylin's Gift right as it expires, and just hope that they use their defensive. Otherwise, the most that you can do outside of having externals is just making sure that they're full health, so they have the highest chance possible of living the debuff. So overall, this room, there's definitely some luck involved on who gets the debuffs. It is really nice if you as the Mistweaver get it, because we have infinite self-healing, we're very tanky, and generally it's just easier to take care of ourselves because of the amount of self-healing and agency we have over our own defensives. We have head runs where it will target our Augmentation Evoker almost every single time. That's pretty unfortunate, as they tend to be on the squishier side, especially outside of defensives. But generally, you handle it the same way regardless. It's just through the spot healing, making sure that people are topped as much as possible for the Chrono Burst, or doing the technology, and then just spot healing and using externals on the people that have the pocket sand. Headed into the double dragon room. This one I handled a little bit differently than I normally do. Given my circumstances, I would actually do it this way again, though I would recommend that people actually hold Chi-Ji. I use it instantly here. Typically, you would not use Chi-Ji until all of the chunks have died, but because we didn't have an Augvoker and this was the first time doing a double without one, I really wanted to make sure that we at least lived the initial hit to kill all of the chunks and get one dragon down. I figured I would have Chi-Ji back by the end of the pack, as I also knew that we were going to be chaining in more chunks for Fennel, because Mistweaver actually does have Healing Funnel. Once Chi-Ji falls off or all the chunks die depending on how you do it, now is the time to start using your defenses as well as your externals. This is also where you're going to spend your first 10 stack of Shaylin's Gift. Bursting came out, so I am going to send my second defensive, and I'm going to step back and just do a little bit of Vivify Cleave healing onto my casters, and then I'm going to use Expel Harm on myself. This footage was taken pre-10.2.5, but now with the new Expel Harm interaction, I'd highly recommend using your Thunder Focus Tea on Expel Harm for these packs. This dragon is almost dead, but in an effort to save mana, as well as to prep for the next dragon, I went ahead and just sent Chi-Ji to catch up as we kill this last dragon and finish off the chunks that we pulled in for Funnel. Single dragons are much easier to handle because there is not an additional pulsing damage. So I'm not worried about having Chi-Ji on pull here. This pull is actually probably the easiest as a Mistweaver, as long as your spinning crank kick is enough to keep you up through the initial damage as you were pulling double. An Augvoker makes this much easier, but comp will vary, and sometimes you don't have it, so. The single dragons are just normally handled with instant Vivifies, the occasional Shaylin's Gift, but generally cooldowns aren't needed, but I do again send Chi-Ji once it's up, just for mana for the next boss, as well as to make it a little easier, though it's not required if you want it on pull. You don't need it on pull for this boss, but it all comes down to preference and comfort. Headed into the actual Blight of Galakrond fight, you want to make sure that you're starting with full mana if you can, and on a level around 27-28, if you're targeted with the Bolt, you want to make sure that you are going to have a defensive for it. You can Shadow Meld the Corrosive Infusion, or Feign Death, or Invis, or Vanish. You can prevent the application in many different ways, but I recommend not doing that until the second or third phases. Typically the third is better just because it's a bit more chaotic, there's more things going on, and there's more damage going out onto the group. And then in the second phase there is the winds portion, where you are going to want to make sure that you trade it to the tank during that. Usually about after the first tick of the winds is when the tank is going to want to take that debuff off of the other player, or that is when you are going to want to make sure you're using those things that prevent application in the first place. At this point in the fight, you should have a 10 stack of Shaylin's Gift, as well as your Chi-Ji activated. You can send defensives here, especially now with 10.2.5 we have an additional Chi Cocoon available as a personal, so that is something that you can do here, but generally you want to use your cooldowns there. We had Chi-Ji and Shaylin's for that one, and we used both of them, but I still have my defensives as well as Cocoon and Revival, and we'll have time to build up another Shaylin's until the next wins. Here I am taking a couple ticks of the wind as I'm pretty tanky, and then my tank is going to come and grab the debuff from me, and then I will let the winds push me back, and I will cast my Shaylin's to top everybody. For P3, there is a bit of random damage going out with the Noxus injections, but you still have the Corrosive Infusion aspect, in addition to a Frontal to dodge and the Necrofrost, which is a root. This can be Sigil of Fear, I believe. It can also be Psychic Screamed. You can Tiger's Lust it off of other people, and you can use Chi-Ji to prevent application on yourself entirely. If you use Chi-Ji and you get the application of the Necrofrost, it is going to show as though you still have the debuff, but you do not. It's just a visual bug. This portion is pretty easy. I tend to just wait on any cooldowns and use my Chi Cocoon or Life Cocoon or my Leaf on people that are going to be targeted with the Corrosive Infusion that don't have a way to avoid it through meld or otherwise. Moving on to Iridikron, this boss I handle the same on Fort as well as Tyran, and it is pretty consistent throughout the entire fight. The only difference is that you may want to have a mana pot available if it is tyrannical. I have Chromie on a focus frame through Voodoo, and I do have a short on showing how to set that up. I highly recommend that for this fight, especially if you are a Mistweaver, because we have a ton of buttons, and if you're like me, most of your stuff is set up in Voodoo or is a mouse over. For every single Stonecracker barrage, you will have Diffuse available, so that is what you're going to use there every single time. And you're just going to send a Shaylun's and try to aim it around the second hit, but if it's the first, it shouldn't be the end of the world, people should still live. After that, we are heading into the Earth Surge phase, and this is where I like to send my Chi-Ji. And during this, I am trying to keep my Ancient Teachings up. I'm doing my best to keep Chromie with our Force set, as well as Enveloping Mist and Renewing Mist. She's often going to be my target for most spells, and then I will cleave off of her through Chi-Ji, Shaylun's Gift, and Vivify. You have so much time to top her, you do not need to blast her full of healing and blow through your mana bar. You can just keep her maintained with the rest of your group. There is a strategy to use our 4-piece on her and have it juice the rest of the group, though it's not something that I like to rely on because it can be inconsistent with the timings, but that is why we are keeping the 4-piece on top of Chromie as much as possible. You shouldn't need to defensive anything else. I like to hold Cocoon and Leaf for a Stonecracker barrage target if they don't have a defensive, or if there's something like an Ogvoker where they're super squishy. Similar to Blight of Galakrond, you can Shadow Meld or Feign or Invis off the Stonecracker barrage. The cast will still go through, and you'll still have to do the soak phase, but you will not have to deal with the dot of the initial target. Once again, we're going to be using Diffuse here. I use Leaf on my Warlock just because he didn't have much of a defensive for this portion of it, though he did the initial hit. I went ahead and sent my Shaylun's in the middle of that, and I popped my Chi-Ji a little bit early just to get people topped before the Earth Surge begins. The rest of this fight is pretty rinse and repeat. It depends on how many shield phases you're going to do. We are going to be lusting this because we want to push this shield as well as beat the next one. That way we don't have to deal with another set of this, so we can 2-chest in addition to not having to heal up Chromie and wasting that mana. I waited until the end of the cast to meld that off, just so we made sure that we got the push, and then I just went ahead and used Diffuse and sent Chi-Ji. There's a decent amount of damage in this phase. I think people underestimate it a lot. You don't need a cooldown, but it is extremely helpful to have Chi-Ji during this. Yazma is one of the bosses I recommend wearing a Icy Pres file for. This is going to reduce the initial damage that you take if you are above 50% HP, but it will increase the damage you take if you're below that. So keep that in mind, that you'll be taking additional damage if you're not topped, but you should live at least the initial hit of the Soul Rend and the Racking Pain if you don't have a defensive. Now that we're in 10.2.5, Mistweaver should have no problem living these, as we have an interaction between Expel Harm and Thunder Focus Tea that gives us a Chi Cocoon. You can do this every 30 seconds, and that allows you to use Life Cocoon on others, as well as just have a little bit more defense during those very frequent mechanics. Typically, my defensive rotation on this is Diffuse, Dampen, Cocoon, and then Leaf, though I try to hold Cocoon and Leaf for other players. So I do recommend holding your Thunder Focus Tea for the Soul Rends, just so you know that you have that extra shield. I also have Fort Brew on, though it's not something that I use pretty regularly. You'll get it once this fight. Usually I will try to pair that with Chi-Ji or my Thunder Focus Tea Expel Harm, just for the extra large shield because they do scale off of health. Typically my Cocoon or Leaf targets are going to be Boomkins. If you have an Ogvoker, they are also a very good target, or Hunters are a good target as well, since they're all pretty squishy and don't have a lot of defensives to draw upon for the Soul Rend or for the Racking Pain if they get targeted by it a lot. Soul Rend still has some spell variants on it, so if you live one time, you may not live the next. It's unfortunate that that's how it works and that it hasn't been fixed, but that is currently an issue that you have to keep in mind. If you have Rage Heart, this is also a really good opportunity to use it here. In this footage, I don't have it, I have the Leaf instead, but that is another defensive, so Mistweaver should be really healthy on this fight, even if you get basically every Racking Pain. Unfortunately, the hard part of this fight is not necessarily something that we can control. We do have an issue of people dying to spiders, others not using a defensive during the Soul Rend or Racking Pain, or people just kind of being crazy with their souls, not dropping them in the right place. There's a lot of group coordination in this encounter that you don't have control over. When it comes to the souls, you do have access to things like Sweep and Rop, and you can kind of help with ad management some, but everything else is pretty much personal responsibility, though you can watch out for your squishier classes for the externals you have, and you can call when you have cheat cocoons or not. All of those are things that you can kind of contribute to the group, though this fight does ultimately fall onto each player to do the correct thing. Typically, I will try to go into each soul split phase with a full stack of Teachings of the Monastery during my Chi-Ji, just so you can instantly top people, either doing that or precasting a Shaylin's Gift to try to get people before that first tick of damage happens after the initial split. The damage that is done to you during the Soul Rend is a fraction of what you do as a group to your souls, so there's a little bit of reflected damage coming in. That's not something a lot of people really keep in mind, but it occasionally does kill people with things like Touch of Death. Just be aware of it, especially if you are a Windwalker and have AoE Touch of Death. Unfortunately for that, I was a few seconds off of my life cocoon, otherwise I would have given it to him since he had called that he had nothing. But this is a fight that you're probably going to spend all of your brezes on. The rest of this dungeon is fairly easy, and there shouldn't really be any situations where you need to rely on those brezes, so that is something that you can kind of plan for. If someone doesn't have something, it is very easy if you have a real brez. However, if you have NG brez, you may not want to use that tactic. There is another thing that people like to do where they purposefully eat the spider pools. Unless it's just one or two, I personally do not like doing this just because the pools never disappear, whereas the spiders can be moved. So I don't like doing that. I know paladins and rogues like to do it because they have immunities, but it ends up usually being more harmful than helpful, with the exception of a couple of stray spiders here and there. So I would avoid doing that if you can. And finally for Yalnu, this fight, whether you want to play Icy Prez or your normal verse file, it really depends on your own gear and your own stats and how comfortable you are with the fight. In this footage, I do have Icy Prez on, though now I do not run this and I just run my normal verse file, but it's really up to you. Once again, now that we are in 10.2.5, we have an additional defensive through our Expel Harm and our Thunder Focus Tea, so that's something that makes this fight a bit easier for us when it comes to just surviving that one shot. For this first Ancient, we are using Zephyr, and I'm also going to send my Chi-Ji. You can send it earlier if you want, and in the instance of the first ad phase, I would recommend sending it early, even though I didn't in this footage, just so you have a better timing on it for the later ones. The solo Colossal Blows, which is the big AoE, is not deadly, and I would generally recommend just healing people up the normal way and not using things like Revival, Chi-Ji, or Shayluns to top people before the next, and instead I would just heal them the normal way. The Colossal Blows that are dangerous are the ones that are happening just before the ad spawns, or the ones that are happening during the ad spawn. For the Colossal Blow that is in the middle of the ad phase, you definitely want to make sure you're using a defensive of some kind. It doesn't have to be a big one. Fort Brew is really good for this because it's a long duration, so I recommend using that. And then again, you have access to the Expel Harm and Thunder Focus Tea, in addition to your Chi-Ji and your normal defensives like Diffuse and Dampen. The ad phases are really the scary part of this fight. And once again, as we have for almost all fights, I am trying to save my Life Cocoon or my Leaf for these squishier classes like Augs, Hunters, or Boomkins. Some groups decide to let ads go, some of them just get missed naturally. I typically like when there's a couple of ads up, just so I can cleave off of them and utilize Ancient Teachings more, though you do want to make sure if you have the big ad up that you're getting those kicks, because the Lasher Venom doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but it can finish someone off if they're already low. This is a fight that you do need to be a little bit aware of your mana for, and part of it depends on how good your group is about using their defensives on the ad phases, how quickly they are getting the ad down, and things like health pots, health stones, and general defensibility of the whole group. It all really depends, so this fight can be up in the air depending on your comp. But Mana Tea is something that you will want to watch here, as you can end up casting quite a bit if you're holding things like Shayluns or Chi-Ji for the ad phases. This fight is pretty rinse and repeat. It is fairly consistent between the ad phases and the actual boss phases. That being said, there is always going to be 1 or 2 ads, depending on your group, that you're not going to have any defensives for, either yourself or others. And this may also coincide with the ad that you do not have any damage cooldowns for. So that one is going to be super scary. That is typically when I'll call people to use health pots and things like that. Try to hold Cocoon for that one. And this is usually one towards the end, like the second to last ad or the last ad, because people want to hold damage for the actual boss itself. And that's fine, but it is just something to be aware of, that the natural cycle of the fight, you'll eventually have 1 or 2 super scary ones. And that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave a comment or hit me up while I am live on Twitch, and I will see you in the next video.